Good morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, depending on which time of day it is for you. Welcome to this course on Regulatory and R&D, The Connection. Whilst I am certainly deep diving into many of the concepts of regulatory, I am equally focusing on the connection between the two worlds, as I do believe that scientifically they both have a great degree of overlap. Just to give you an introduction to myself, my name is Karen Mann. Previously, I was Regulatory Affairs Global Director at Intercos here in Italy. And after that, I went to Dolce Gabbana to take in charge also quality in Milan. My previous experience started at L'Oréal, where I was in the factory doing quality control. I then moved to Paris into the International Direction of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs, where I was coordinating all the different zones, obviously not all in one go. My previous experiences were also at Walgreens Boots Alliance and equally at Burberry in the UK. Prior to my professional experience, I obtained a PhD in inorganic chemistry from the University of Bristol, and I have 15 publications in international journals. I was equally a chartered chemist. You can see all my publications and all the details about me on my LinkedIn profile, and I have attached the link below on the slide. I would now like to take you through the agenda and the course overview. Then I will go into a bit more detail of the course objectives. The final section of the introduction will be dealing with what is a cosmetic product in the eyes of the law. So now to begin with the agenda and the course overview. There are 8 modules in this training course. The first one is the introduction, which is what I'm doing at the moment. Modules 2 to 4 really focus on the ingredient part of regulatory. We will look at the drivers of cosmetic ingredient restrictions, as they are not only legislative. We will then look at the cosmetic ingredients under the spotlight, and equally some cosmetic risky ingredient categories. These will be very useful if you are either a formulator or a marketeer. For Module 5, we will be placing products on the market, on global markets. And this module will be particularly useful for those in sales. Module 6 deals with the EU regulations in depth. I have wanted to discuss these in particular so that it will give you a very good foundation to understand any of the hot topics which could figure in any regulation of the world. Module 7 deals with claims, and here we deep dive into claims and equally claim substantiation. And the final module deals with the product development process and goes into where are the regulatory and R&D touchpoints. So now to take you through a little bit more detail on each of the modules. Module 2 deals with the drivers of cosmetic ingredient restrictions. Historically, cosmetic regulation was the driver of ingredient restrictions, and above all based on safety. However, legislation is not the only driver anymore for cosmetic restrictions. And I will go into these actors specifically during the module. We know that sustainability and environmental and consumers and NGOs and the press are all playing an active role. So Module 3 looks at cosmetic ingredients under the spotlight. I'm starting off with R&D and thinking about what are the functional ingredients, what are the aesthetic ingredients, and what are the others. Each of these categories used in formulations are affected in different ways by different types of risk. These can be media, regulations, the environment, and health and safety. And by understanding these, you will understand more about how these categories of ingredients are affected by regulatory. In Module 4, we will deep dive into the cosmetic risky ingredient categories, really focusing from a regulatory point of view. What are the issues, how have they arisen, and what is the future? We will equally look at the impact of these ingredients and how it can affect R&D. This deals with cyclosiloxanes, D4, D5 and D6, microplastics, endocrine disruptors, CMRs, carcinogenic, mutagenic and reprotoxic for reproduction, nanomaterials, fragrance allergens, and lastly, heavy metals. Now that we have understood more about the legislative principles for ingredients, we will now look at how to place a cosmetic product on a global market in terms of registrations. We will deep dive into the legislative models of the EU, USA, Canada, and China, because by understanding these models, you will then have a foundation to be able to understand the legislative models of any worldwide country. And the reason is because many other countries in the world follow the similar type of model to those countries, or a combination. There are, of course, other models which we will discuss, and this is particular Australia. I have not detailed Japan in this training session, mainly because Japan is a complicated regulation, and I believe it deserves a module all by itself, as well as Korea. Should you wish to have more detail about these markets, then of course a different training course could be provided. Following on from this, in Module 6, we will look at hot topics in the EU regulations. The EU regulations is one of the leaders of the regulatory models in the world. And I believe that if you understand the topics that are discussed at EU level, you will have a greater understanding of any of the topics that are discussed in any legislation around the world, as they are all relatively similar. So this module is dedicated to helping in your understanding of what can be regulated and how this could impact the business. Module 7 deals with claims, and we will look at the principles associated with regulatory as well as R&D. We will look at the wording in claims, but equally the test reports and the claim substantiation. This involves looking at the consumer panel and the protocols. It is important to know how these should be presented and how these should be formatted, because there are a few markets around the world who require pre-authorization of claims and or advertising, or even registration. It is therefore key that you do understand what is required so that you haven't wasted a lot of money and time, and when it comes to the authorization process, you do not have a barrier to trade. Equally, it is important that within an organization, you have a claims process, and you need to know how to navigate the legislation as well as borderline products. The final module deals with the product development process, as well as the regulatory and R&D touchpoints. There are a few product development types, as well as different drivers for developing cosmetic projects, which will be discussed. Internally, it is highly important to have an effective product development process, so to have a fully successful product launch. If not, there can be a great impact to the business on time and cost. It is equally important to understand how regulatory and R&D interact during the product development process, and this will be discussed in detail. Now that we have looked at the agenda and the course overview, I would like to now turn our attention to the course objectives. And here we will look at an overview of the type of knowledge that you will have gained during this training course. And I hope that this will help you in your role either in regulatory or in R&D or in sales or indeed in marketing. And I've given you a greater foundational knowledge of how regulatory can affect your business. So looking at these course objectives, if you're a cosmetic formulator, it is really key to understand how ingredients are legislated, but equally what other factors could impact their use in cosmetic products. As we will discuss in the modules on ingredients, there are not only legislative constraints surrounding them. It is therefore vital that you understand which ones do affect certain ingredients and how you can navigate around this. It is also equally important to understand the ingredients under the spotlight, but equally which ingredients will have a legislative change in the future. As you know, you are developing a product now to be put in the market maybe in 18 months' time. Marketing equally need to be aware of these points when they are developing the product brief. Lastly, for claims, it is equally important for marketing and also R&D to understand claims, both in how to word the claims in a compliant way, but equally to know how to substantiate them, so that you will have no barriers to trade when you wish to go to market. As I've mentioned, the other part of the product development process is obviously placing a product on the market, without which no sales can be made. This is where the sales teams come in. And therefore, by understanding the EU regulations, it will help sales teams also understand global regulations, and equally what can be done to navigate these. This is essential as it is the final step in the product development process and in making the sales and the business. Lastly, product development is key to the entire process, and as I mentioned before, it needs to be efficient and effective, making a product a reality from the product brief. Otherwise, there will be no sales at all and no marketing to do. So essentially, this training course provides R&D, sales and marketing with foundational knowledge and key considerations when they are developing and placing a cosmetic product on global markets. It will also provide the business a way of navigating the regulatory environment safely, whilst respecting key legislative principles. It is imperative that when you are trying to place a product on the market and you are dealing with authorities, that you are able to navigate the different concepts effectively to give credibility and also build trust with the regulatory authorities. In essence, I believe that this training course will be your toolkit, as a lot of it is focused on principles rather than the actual detail of the regulations. And I hope that this will help you in navigating the world of regulatory within your business. Lastly, within this introduction, we will look at regulatory and R&D. We will look at what exactly is regulatory. What are the stakeholders? And then how does regulatory exactly interact with R&D? Then we will focus on the legislation in terms of the definition of a cosmetic product and why that is important to know. This will then lead on to touching on borderlines and what are the consequences when we start to move closer and closer to the drug world. So what exactly is regulatory? There is actually no definition of what regulatory really is, so how can we define it? Many people have different perceptions of regulatory, some accurate, some completely far from the truth. It could be described as boring, possibly. It could also be described as restrictive, especially when you're dealing with innovation. What about fear? What about the penalties? What about the financial cost? What about going to prison? Equally, it seems that regulatory people can be just simply checking things all the time. And maybe you might think that it is a solitary job. I would like to try to share with you during this training course a much wider scope of what regulatory really is, so that you get a much clearer understanding of regulatory and exactly what does it mean when you have a regulatory team and a regulatory profession. So as there is no official definition of regulatory, I thought it best to actually look at what is involved in regulatory. First of all, let us look at ingredients. As you know, we will discuss these in the next few modules. But essentially, the ingredient side overlaps highly with R&D. Ingredients are fundamental to a cosmetic company. They are the basis for which all the cosmetic formulations are made. Therefore, which ingredients should you put in the products? Should you just conform to the legislation, or should you go above and beyond and have your own company position in relation to ingredients? More often than not, companies are quite interested, and certainly consumers are interested to know what is your company position in relation to ingredients that have not yet been legislated. And in some cases, even ingredients that have been legislated. Factors such as consumer perception may mean that you as a company decide to ban that ingredient internally. And I therefore believe that the outcome of ingredients is essentially a blacklist. And it is also imperative to anticipate ingredient legislation well in advance so that you are not caught short when it comes to placing your products on the market. Next, we can look at finished products. Regulatory certainly interacts with the finished products, in particular the artwork. Yes, they may not interact with the design. This is done by the marketing team. However, a lot of the text that is on the packaging needs to be verified to make sure that your product is compliant for global markets. However, where it becomes really interesting is not just looking at the tick box approach, but rather working with marketing to see how you can create a product artwork that really links the design with the regulatory world. And these factors become really interesting during the challenges that you can have when you're doing an artwork. In relation to the formula, as I mentioned with ingredients, regulatory obviously interacts a lot with the formulation. And I don't just mean about the ingredient legislation. I also mean that they interact in terms of good manufacturing practice. This, of course, is more quality and quality control. And it means that during the manufacturing process, you do need to follow certain guidelines and certain practices which are actually defined in the International Standards Organization 22716. This is highly important if you wish to develop right first-time products and equally to avoid destructions, and therefore to not have quality control issues and therefore customer complaints once your product gets to market. Regulatory can equally interact on the packaging side. The regulations on packaging are evolving, and especially with heavy metals that could potentially be found in packaging. As you know, the R&D team need to do compatibility studies. They need to see if there are any issues with the interaction of the formula with the packaging, as sometimes certain formulations could cause packaging to leach out some of the toxic compounds. However, this is rare when you do a compatibility study, and it is essential that these are followed. Regulatory team do need to ensure that the compatibility study is written in the correct way, together with quality, to make sure that there are no barriers to trade again when you're trying to place your products on the market. On the right-hand side, we're talking more a different aspect of regulatory, which perhaps many people are not aware of. And this is scientific affairs. Clearly, when you are making a legislation, you need to ensure that you understand scientific topics. Yes, regulation is regulatory. However, essentially, regulations are scientific topics which are regulated. It is also, therefore, quite interesting to work in lobbying and influencing, and this is a part that I really enjoyed. I have represented the companies L'Oréal in the French Trade Industry Association for the Middle East. I then represented WBA in the UK Trade Association on REACH, which is the chemical legislation. I equally represented L'Oréal at Cosmetics Europe in the China Task Force, and so on. The importance of lobbying is that, yes, you don't necessarily work directly with the government authorities, although I have had interaction with government authorities from China and also from Iran. But the basis of these working groups at the trade industries associations is that you work with other big players like Chanel, Procter & Gamble, as well as some of the smaller players who are also members of these groups. As a group, you therefore decide what is our position that will be presented to the government of that country. It is a very interesting part of the job, and I believe is essential when you are creating legislation, as you can really be an actor involved in creating legislation from the upfront. Another aspect which is fascinating is advertising and claims. You are clearly working very closely with marketing, but equally with the R&D, who are doing the claim substantiation. In terms of advertising, it is quite glamorous, of course. However, there are a lot of restrictions that you have on the wording. And what is actually quite interesting is really using your creative mind to try to find ways to navigate what the marketing wish to say. The goal of regulatory, in my view, is to help the company navigate the regulations and help the company make money, but at the same time protect the company, so that when issues arise, you are therefore able to stand in front of an authority and be able to negotiate with the authority accordingly. Another aspect is also the international side of regulatory. Regulatory is global. Every market is touched by regulatory. Many markets of the world now have a cosmetic regulation in place, and if they don't, they have followed generally a model, which we'll discuss on the EU, Canada, US, China, or even Japan. There is a lot of aspects of regulatory which is dealing with negotiation. This is negotiation with marketing on the claims. It's negotiating with marketing on the artwork. It's equally negotiating with the authorities or distributors. And the goal is basically to try to get your product on the market, but equally make your product in a compliant way, so that subsequently you do not have any issues. You have to consider that regulatory's job is not done until the consumer is completely happy with the product. Equally, that is where quality control comes in. And customer complaints is definitely a teamwork between regulatory and quality control. Customer complaints have to be managed effectively, as you do not want to have any serious undesirable events and have some of your customers in hospital. But this essentially is the goal, that right from the beginning, regulatory are involved, but together with many other departments, which create a safe and effective product, which is profitable for the business.